Hello. In this presentation, I will talk about the Amazon's Simple Workflow service. And the goal is to provide an overview of this service and to also demonstrate how one can build and execute a simple workflow. As an example, we will build a workflow which will get a list of files in some specified input S3 bucket. Then it will send those files for scanning to the CLAM AV virus scan app, which would deploy it on EC2 instance, and based on the scan results it will move the files into either clean or infected S3 target. So first of all, what is the Amazon workflow service? It is a framework that allows you to implement distributed asynchronous workflow applications. Some of the features that it provides are, first of all, reliable execution of the distributed asynchronous activities and the reliable data exchange between them. It also provides ability to build pretty complex decision-based flows and incorporate the long-running and manual tasks as well. It holds execution history and it allows you to monitor the workflow execution. It also has some advanced features like sending signals to the executing workflow, versioning of the workflows, and having complex parent-child relationship workflows. Some of the drawbacks is the heavy use of aspects for code generation, which makes the debugging quite difficult. And also there is a lack of good documentation that would explain how to implement some complex scenarios like loops, host-specific execution, and such. Let's take a look at the basic application structure of the simple workflow. The part that you see in the cloud is hosted in the Amazon's workflow service, and it basically hosts the lists of tasks. Two types: the decision tasks and activity tasks. The decision tasks are used by the workflow worker, and the activities tasks are used by the activity workers. And those are the main components that we'll be focusing on, because that's what you need to implement in order to get your workflow working. The activity worker is the component that holds the activities implementations, and it calls the Amazon's simple workflow service for the activity tasks, and then as the activity tasks are marked as needed to be executed, it executes them and sends the results back to SWF. The workflow worker component holds the actual workflow logic implementation, such as orchestration of the tasks, handling task failures, and asynchronous invocation of activities via the activity clients. And those clients are actually generated and built by via the ASPICT-J annotations. Then the other component that has to be developed is the workflow starter. That's a component that actually kicks off the workflow instance execution by using the workflow client that is also generated, and it can also send the signals to the running workflow. So those are the components that we'll focus on mostly, and we will look at the details of the implementation of those components on the example of the simple workflow that we are building. You most likely will need to set up your Eclipse or some other IDE in order to build the workflow applications, and there are like a few tricks. In particular, you have to install ASPICT-J and you have to enable the annotation processing so that all those clients could be generated. So let's take a look at the specific components that would have to be built. So for the activities components, we have to first create an interface annotated with the add activities annotation. Then we have to implement that interface and create an activities host application which will register and start those activities. Then for the workflow component, we have to implement the workflow interface with the add workflow annotation and one execute method, which will be the starting point of the workflow. And we have to implement that interface with the concrete workflow logic, and we also have to create a workflow host application And the last component is the workflow starter application, which will be kicking off the workflow. So let's look at the details of each of those classes. So first is the activities interface, and as you see here, it is annotated with the add activities annotation, which is the Amazon specific annotation, and each of the methods are the concrete activities that are provided by this specific activities interface. So when we implement the activities interface, we can provide additional information via the constructor, like some additional resources, like for example, if I need S3 client or I need the instance of the CLAM scan application. So this can be done by passing the parameters into the constructor. And then we need to implement the activities themselves. So here's an example of the implementation of a virus scan activity, which gets the data from a file in S3 bucket and then sends that file to the virus scan. Or actually, it doesn't send the file; it gives the input stream, which then will be scanned, and the result will be returned back. So the next component that we will have to implement is the activities host, and that the application that creates the activity worker that we saw before registered the concrete activities implementation with the worker and starts the worker. The next set of components are the workflow related components. So first is the workflow interface, which needs to be marked with the add workflow annotation, and it also needs to have one method that is marked with the add execute annotation, and that is the starting point of the workflow. And the most interesting part is the actual implementation of this interface, because this is where the logic of the workflow is implemented. So it can be implemented in many different ways using different Amazon constructs. So one of those is the task class, which basically can be used to chain activities and make sure that one activity is not started until the result from the previous activity is available. All activities are executed asynchronously, so this is not as simple as just calling one activity after another. And the next component that has to be implemented is the workflow host, and that is the one that, similarly to the activity host, it creates a workflow worker, adds the concrete workflow implementation to it, and starts it. And the last component that has to be implemented is the workflow starter, and that's where we actually kick in the workflow off. So important part of this workflow is the virus scan functionality. To implement that, I've used a very popular virus scan application, ClamAV, and set it up on an Amazon EC2 instance. It is pretty simple to set up. All you need to do is just get an EC2 instance with some Linux OS and then install ClamAV using the normal installation procedure. Like in the case of Ubuntu, you just use the apt-get to install ClamAV and install the ClamAV daemon. One note here is that you have to modify the ClamD configuration file to open up the TCP socket, because that's how the data will be streamed into the ClamAV for virus scanning. So as you can see here, I've specified the TCP address and TCP socket, and the TCP address here is the private IP address of the EC2 instance that ClamAV is installed on. You also need to open the port 3310 or whatever port you configured your ClamAV to listen on your EC2 instance as specified here. And then all you need to do is to just start the ClamAV service as a daemon. So then to actually submit the files for virus scanning to the ClamAV server, you have to connect to the TCP port, and you have to send the byte stream content of the file to that TCP port. There are multiple libraries that can be used for that, and I've used one of such libraries, ClamVJ, written by Phil Varner, which provides you a ClamScan class that basically is a client to the ClamAV application. It is pretty easy to use. All you need to do is to create this class and specify where the ClamAV is deployed on, host, port, timeout, and then you can just call the scan method and pass the input data stream to it. And what you get back is the status of the scan. If this is success, it means that there is no virus detected, and if it is not success, then obviously the virus was detected, and there will be some details in that scan result object as well. So now we are ready to actually try to execute our workflow. Some setup before we do that. First of all, we have to create a new domain in the workflow console. So I've created a new domain, VirusScan domain, and also updated all the configuration files for the project. And also, we need to set up all those S3 buckets that will be used for input and output of the workflow. So those the input directory is the input bucket is this one, the dirty input, and I've uploaded a few images, a few files into that bucket. So in order to run the workflow, you have to actually start all those three applications. So the first one is the activity host, the second one is the workflow host, and the third one is the execution starter. So we can try to run them live. So here let's first start the activity host. So you can see that actually that the specific activities task list has been pulled for the activities, and that is also configured in the configuration file for the project. Next we will start the workflow host, and finally we will start the workflow execution starter, which will kick off the whole workflow. But before we do that, let's verify that what we have and or not have in our S3 buckets. So here is the dirty input bucket, and as you can see there are three files in here, and here is the clean bucket, which has nothing right now. So now let's run the workflow. Let's run this workflow, and you can actually see here how the activities are being invoked. So you can see here that, for example, the scan for viruses have started, and it was scanning the VirusScan service test file, then it was scanning the cat picture, and then it was and it didn't determine any viruses there either. So so let's see what's happening now in the S3 buckets. Let's go back and let's see what we have. So now there is nothing in the dirty input, all files removed, and we can see that all the files were successfully moved into the clean directory because no viruses were detected. So we have just successfully executed the workflow, and one other thing that I wanted to show is how you can use the workflow console to actually execute the status, to actually examine the status of the executed workflow. So let's go into the workflow console. This is the console, and let's see what executions we have here. So you can see that this is the last execution that happened. Let's open it up, and you can see some details that it actually executed successfully, it completed. You can also see all the events and all that happened there, and you can actually even see the input and output of each of them. So like, for example, this one is move files to destinations. It shows you which files were moved as part of the input. And you can also see which activities were executed as part of this workflow. So this is a pretty interesting tool, and it really allows you to verify your workflow execution. You can also see all what workflow types and activity types you have registered here with their versions. I have multiple versions of 1.5. I have multiple versions of different activities and workflows as I was developing them, so you can actually specify specific versions that you want to run for a specific workflow. So this is pretty much all that I wanted to show, and I hope that this presentation was useful. Thank you.